Good evening, my dear friends. I hope you're all doing very well. We're going to be learning right now the 8th chapter of the laws of Shabbat. And over here we're going to be learning about the first couple of the primary labors that we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Namely, beginning with the concept that we're not allowed to plow on Shabbat. Which means that we're not allowed to weed roots, or to cut the grass, or prune any shoots, to beautify the land. Any of these are derivatives of plowing, and we're not allowed to do even the slightest amount of plowing on Shabbat. And so to also, the same concept will also apply if there's a hole in the ground, that you're not allowed to flatten it. And similarly also, if there is a little pile of earth, we're not allowed to flatten that as well. So that's the idea of we're not allowed to plow on Shabbat. Same next commandment is that we're not allowed to sow. So even the slightest amount, we're not allowed to sow on Shabbat. So therefore, a person who prunes a tree so that it should grow better is in order that it should help the tree grow. That's something which we're not allowed to do. So to also, a person is not allowed to water the grass or to water a plant on Shabbat because, again, we are helping it to grow. So that's something which we're not allowed to do. Next concept is that we're not allowed to reap. So in other words, to cut a something which is growing, we're not allowed to cut it from its source. And, uprooting anything from its source is all within this concept that we're not allowed to reap on Shabbat. And anything which is connected to its source, we're not allowed to disconnect from its source. Even if we're talking about like moss that's growing on a rock, which technically speaking, the rock is not the thing which is giving it its life, but still, since this is its place where it lives and this is where it grows, you are not allowed to separate it and uproot it from its place where its habitat. And anything where whenever you are reaping from a plant and it's causing it to grow larger, so in such a case, this person is going to actually be liable for two different things at the same time. One, because they are performing the labor of reaping, but also they are doing the idea of planting because now it's going to grow better. So that's, again, a similar concept. And even if a tree has dried out, so now essentially this tree seemingly has no life, and you're not disconnecting it from source. But right now, since the tree is still standing, even though its branches and leaves are dead, but still you would not be allowed to separate it from their source on Shabbat, as long as they are still standing, and it's the form of a tree standing up. So when we're talking about uprooting, so the amount that a person has to uproot in order to be liable is the amount of like a fig. So the size of a fig is the amount of how much a person would have to do in order to be liable. Anything less than that, it wouldn't be liable, although it's still not allowed. And if a person is uprooting some fruits or anything which is growing, which is edible, so that would be the amount if you're taking it for food. If you're taking it to feed an animal, so then it's the amount of the amount of to fill the mouth of a baby goat, of a young kid. So that's the amount that it would have to be in order to be liable. And so if a person cuts chopped wood, for instance, in order to burn it, not for eating purposes, so then it has to be the amount in order to cook an egg. So that's like it's regular type of size egg, and it has to be in order to cook that egg. That's how much wood it would be needed in order to do that, or whatever substance if the person is uprooting from the ground. Now, a person who collects figs and makes a chain out of them, so essentially they are stringing a necklace. So they're taking these figs and they make holes in them, and now they're stringing it on a string, and now it became a new thing. So that is something which is not allowed to be done, because it's the same thing as collecting sheaves, which is not allowed to be done on Shabbat, because over here you're collecting these figs and you are putting them together. So that's something which we're not allowed to do, and this doesn't just apply only to figs, but anything that has the same circumstances, similar circumstances, would have the same concept, same prohibition. Now, the next thing is that we're not allowed to thresh on Shabbat. So a person who threshes the size of a dried fig is going to be liable. And so too also, extracting produce from its shell is a derivative of threshing. So anything which has a shell, so to speak, and now you are extracting something from inside it, would not be allowed to be done on Shabbat. So for instance, a person is not allowed to milk a cow on Shabbat because you are extracting milk from the cow. So too also, a person is not allowed to wound an animal. Well, in general, we should never wound an animal, but especially on Shabbat, we're not allowed to wound an animal because you are extracting blood from the animal. That isn't the case. A person would only be liable if he's doing it for the need, because they need the blood. But if they're just doing it in order to wound the animal, just for destructive reasons, so then the truth is that they would not be liable, because, as we said earlier on, whenever a person does something just for a destructive reason in regards to Shabbat, since it's not for an intent of any purpose of good, so they would actually not be liable. So it's a very interesting thing. Because they're doing it just for destructive, so then they're not actually liable. They might be liable for something else because they're hurting an animal, but that's a different discussion. So that's all in regards to an animal. But if a person applies a wound, someone hurts someone else on Shabbat, another human being, because they're very upset and they want to punch them, God forbid, and now they make them bleed, so then they would be liable on Shabbat. Why? For an entirely different reason. Because it's considered as if they have done something constructive. Something which is something which we're not allowed to construct. We're not allowed to build on Shabbat. We're not allowed to fix on Shabbat, So since we're not allowed to fix on Shabbat, when a person who is very upset, and now that he has given a punch to someone else, now he is now feeling cool and their anger is subsiding, that is the concept of constructive. In other words, fixing, setting it into place, which is something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. So that's why we're not allowed specifically to punch someone in anger on Shabbat and make them bleed. Now, in regards to animals, so there are usually, when we're talking about creeping animals, creepy crawlies, so then there's a person. Let me try to explain this like this. One of the problems of wounding an animal on Shabbat is because the fact that you're extracting the blood. That would be the problem. If they don't have a skin, in a real skin, so then it's not counted as extracting because it doesn't have to go through the skin to come out. That's what it says in Jewish law. The Torah mentions 8 specific creepy crawlies we are not allowed to wound on Shabbat. But any of the other ones, they don't really have a skin, and then a person would not be liable, although it's not allowed. But for this now, in the same vein, moving on to something a little bit more practical, in the same vein, a person is not allowed to extract juice from a fruit on Shabbat. So you're not allowed to take an orange, squeeze it to drink it, because you are taking away from the food and you're turning it into a liquid and you're extracting it and making it into two items. So that's something which we're not allowed to do. So essentially, according to the Torah, an olive and a grape are the main fruits that we would squeeze in order to make wine or oil. An orange is not something which is necessarily something which we make orange juice out of, according to the basic text of the Torah. So technically, according to basic Torah law, it only applies to an olive and to a grape, but the rabbis have said that it also applies to all the other ones, so that we shouldn't come to do the olives and the grapes. So we're not allowed to squeeze an orange to make orange juice on Shabbat. What about if you're making a salad, and now you want to take a lemon and you want to squeeze lemon juice into the salad? Are you allowed to do that? So the Rambam says that you are allowed to, because when you're squeezing from the lemon straight into the salad, you're actually not making it into something else. You're not making it from food into a liquid, but rather you're making it from the food in the lemon into food again in the salad. So then that would be allowed. Now, that is all if you're squeezing it right into the salad. The problem is you're not allowed to squeeze it into a cup and then pour from the cup into the salad, because once you pour it into the cup, you're making it into a substance of lemon juice, which that's something which we're not allowed to do. Now, the same concept of winnowing, which is to split, when you split the little kernels and you want to blow away the extras. So that's something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat, and that has a very strong implication into what we are not allowed to do on Shabbat in regards to separating. So we're not allowed to separate on Shabbat when it comes in general, and especially when it comes to food. That's where it gets a little bit more complicated, and the Rambam starts discussing what is it that we are allowed to separate on Shabbat, and what is it that we're not allowed to separate on Shabbat. Because the concept of separation on Shabbat is something which, generally speaking, we're not allowed to do. So, if we have two items, we have, whatever it is, two items that are mixed together, and now you want to separate them. So you have, like a strainer or something like that. So that is something which we are not allowed to do on Shabbat, and the person who does that would be liable on Shabbat. Now, if we have two items that are mixed together, so let's say you have a salad, cucumbers and tomatoes, and you like cucumbers but you don't like the tomatoes. All right, so this is going to be our analogy today in order to understand the laws of separation on Shabbat, this is what the Rambam is focusing now over here at the end of the chapter. So he says like this: if a person is right now in the middle of eating and they have their salad on their plate, and there is cucumbers and tomatoes, they only want to eat the cucumbers, they do not want to eat the tomatoes. So we are not allowed to take away and separate the bad out of the good. In other words, we're not allowed to take these tomatoes and move them to the side of the plate and then eat the cucumbers. That's something which we're not allowed to do. What we are allowed to do is that we're allowed to pick out the cucumbers from the tomatoes and put them aside and eat. And then you can throw out the tomatoes. Once that's the only thing that's left, you can now move them to another plate. But you're allowed to separate the good from the bad and not the bad from the good. All right, I hope you understand. This is a very important concept when it comes to separation on Shabbat. So you're allowed to pick the good out of the bad, but not the bad out of the good. In other words, the thing that you want to eat, that you can pick out. Don't pick out the thing that you don't want to eat and put it away. Put it on the side. So in our case, when we're having a salad and we take out the cucumbers which we want to eat, so that's allowed to be done. The only thing that we have to note, which is important, is that we're only allowed to do this if we're going to be eating it right now. It can't be an hour before the dinner, and now, you made the salad and you realize, why did I put in the tomatoes? I don't like tomatoes. So you can't now go and pick out all the good substances, the cucumbers, and move them into another bowl and then eat them in an hour. No, it's only in a case where you're eating it right now that you will be allowed to do. So that's in general in regards to the laws of separation. Similar concept if you have wine or oil or water which aren't really clean and you want to strain them, that's something which we're not allowed to do. But the Rambam does say that in a case where the water is clean, but you want to make it really sparkling and you put it through a towel, so that's something which you are allowed to do. Grinding is something which we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. So you're not allowed to take, let's say, complete, if these black peppers or salts that you take and you grind them right into the food. That's something which we're not allowed to do, because we're not allowed to grind on Shabbat. Same concept we said also, as we explained yesterday, that cutting something into very small, if you're making a salad and you're cutting it into very, very small pieces, that's similar to grinding, and that's something which we're not allowed to do. Sifting is also something which is not allowed to be done on Shabbat. So we're not allowed to sift the amount of a dried fig, which is usually the amount, which is, when we're talking about the laws of Shabbat, it's the size of a dried fig. That's something which we're not allowed to do. It's just measuring a stick, this dried fig. Kneading, again, someone who kneads dough, what size? The size of a dried fig would be liable. Mixing earth to use as cement is also a derivative of kneading. So that's also not allowed to be done. So that's basically the concept of these laws that we have discussed today. We're starting to discuss the various laws slightly more in detail, going into them to start to understand what we are and what we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. So that is the chapter for today, and we will see you tomorrow.